Welcome to online tutor training at GRCC. Today we'll be talking about enhancing intercultural communication in your tutoring labs. When communicating with those from cultures other than our own, and more to the point, people who are different than us, it's really helpful to think about the things we have in common, not just the things which are different. With this in mind, let's look at our goals for the day. First, we are going to discuss why cross-cultural communication is important, particularly in the context of higher education. Next, we will explore the meaning of culture, as well as a working definition of intercultural communication. When we finish with that, we will discuss a few potential manifestations of culture, as they might appear in our labs. Finally, our training will conclude with a section of strategies you can apply when working with culturally diverse students. Some of you might be asking why it is important to learn about intercultural communication. In doing so, you are not alone. Many U.S. Americans feel that culture in the United States is homogeneous, meaning there is only a single U.S. culture. At first glance, one cannot be blamed for arriving at this conclusion, especially for those of us who live in certain areas of the United States. Most Americans, we believe, speak the same language, celebrate the same holidays, subscribe to the same set of rules and laws, study the same ideas in school, even consume and enjoy the same forms of popular culture. However, upon closer inspection, we see that these assumptions do not hold for all Americans and, in fact, are becoming more and more tenuous. The United States is, in fact, one of the most diverse countries in the world and continues to diversify with each passing moment. It has been said that one does not have to live long in the U.S. to see the diversity. As the United States becomes more diverse, it becomes all the more important to be able to work with this increasing diversity. This ability will be the key to your success as a tutor, and more broadly, our ability to understand and work with those different than ourselves will determine the success of GRCC, our community, and our society as a whole. This is a big topic, one that resists simplification. People who become adept at intercultural communication usually do so over long periods of time and with a lot of experience and practice. In light of this, it might be helpful for you to think of today's training to be a good starting point in how you might think about culture, about how culture affects your lives, and how it will affect your work as tutors. So let's get started. To get an idea of just how diverse the United States truly is, and how it continues to diversify, let's take a look at a few revealing statistics. According to the U.S. Census, there are 381 different languages spoken in the United States. Over 30 ethnicities in the United States with over 1 million members, and over 100 religions and religious denominations practiced in the U.S. Of course, these three categories only begin to scratch the surface of diversity in the United States. Diversity can be defined and measured by using other concepts and categories such as race, age, gender, nationality, sexual orientation, political affiliation, and so on. The fact that many social scientists disagree on what exactly diversity means and how, or even if it can be accurately measured, tells you it is a very complex and complicated topic. For our purposes here, the point is to recognize how people of the United States resist easy classification and grouping. The workforce and systems of education are hardly immune from diversity. In fact, some of the major challenges that involve diversity play out in these two sectors of society. Until recently, the American workforce was relatively homogeneous. However, in recent years, the workforce in the U.S. has experienced radical, even tectonic changes in its composition. Long gone are the days of it being predominantly white males. Today, the U.S. workforce is comprised of people from all ethnic groups, religions, languages, and so on. The contemporary workforce is so diverse, in fact, that according to several studies, employers are under strong pressure to find employees who are culturally astute and able to thrive in a global and interculturally diverse work environment. The same claims can be made about higher education in the United States today as well. With more international and first-generation students attending college than ever before, it is all the more important that students, faculty, and staff are equipped with the skill sets and attitudes to facilitate competent and respectful communication. Probably the most relevant reason why intercultural communication is important has to do with the work you will be doing in your tutorial lab. As you know, the goal of tutoring is to help students achieve success. However, when you work with students who have different values, beliefs, and standards than yourself, it can at times be a challenge. Remaining mindful of these potential differences while also working to find common ground can make all the difference. Developing sound intercultural communication skills is also important because it will give you an opportunity to learn about other points of view, preferences, and ways of doing things. And finally, your student will have the chance to learn more about your culture. In the end, we can create a free flow of information and understanding that will allow us to create the best tutoring situation possible. Before we delve into what intercultural communication is and how we might more effectively practice it, it is a good idea to first have a grasp of what the term culture means. For many of us, it's one of those terms we are familiar with, maybe even know it when we see it, but have a difficult time defining it on our own. This shouldn't be too surprising given there isn't an exact definition even experts agree on. However, there are a few aspects and properties of the term culture most people do recognize. First, culture is learned. Although it may seem culture, maybe even your own culture, is innate or hardwired, culture is something individuals acquire through learning experiences, especially those that take place early in one's life. Second, culture is complex. There are several, if not numerous, things that make up one's culture. In other words, no culture is defined by a single characteristic, such as a language or religion. Instead, all cultures, are comprised of many related yet different aspects. Third, culture has visible and invisible dimensions. Though there are many things we can observe about one's culture as well as our own, namely behaviors and practices like, say, how a certain holiday is celebrated, there are many aspects to a culture which are invisible. These things take the form of assumptions, values, beliefs, and attitudes. While these things can and often do give rise to observable behaviors, they are not in themselves directly observable. Some people find it helpful to think about culture in terms of an iceberg. Above the surface, you have things you can see, such as food, art, dance, and traditions. Below the surface, however, those are the things which cannot directly be observed, such as one's beliefs, values, and worldview. They are, however, related, as the invisible aspects of culture tend to give rise to the visible. Another way to think about it is that those things which are a part of our visible culture are expressions of the beliefs and values that are invisible, or below the surface. An example might be certain religious beliefs. In themselves, they are not directly observable. However, the way they might play out in a wedding, a funeral, or in other religious practice is observable. Finally, notice how the very bottom of the iceberg says common humanity and lists things like love, laughter, and seeking meaning in our lives. These are things which are common across all cultures, meaning all human beings place value on these. This is a nice reminder that, despite certain cultural differences, people hold many fundamental things in common. Sometimes it is tempting to think that our own values, beliefs, and behaviors are somehow standard, or even right, and therefore not part of a culture. This is especially tempting when we are part of a dominant culture and haven't yet had the opportunity to reflect on what culture means. Remember what we said earlier. Culture is a learned phenomenon. People are not born or hardwired with culture. It is something they absorb and develop over time, and therefore it applies to us just as it does everyone else. So to think that we are immune from culture, or that only people different from ourselves have a culture, is an inaccurate assumption. Simply put, intercultural communication is a type of communication that aims to share and receive information across different cultures. Although the use of language plays a disproportionate role, intercultural communication also focuses on social attributes, thought patterns, the legitimacy of certain ideas, and of course, nonverbal cues or body language. When we think about all the things that go into making up a particular culture, such as particular beliefs, values, traditions, and worldviews, and how these things can impact how, why, and what we communicate, we can see how communication between cultures might differ. Some experts point out that culture not only influences how we transmit our communication, but also how we decipher or make sense of how others communicate. With this in mind, we can see how communication breakdown might occur if we are not attuned to the relationship between culture and communication. Here are two relatively simple examples to illustrate intercultural communication. Imagine you are working with a student from an East Asian country like South Korea. As you work through your tutoring session, you notice your student avoids making eye contact. So much so that he spends minutes at a time decidedly averting his gaze from you. Experiencing this, you might wonder if you did something wrong, or perhaps think the student isn't engaged. If you were born and raised in the United States, you may have good reasons to react this way. Many people in the U.S. have absorbed the belief that a certain amount of eye contact is appropriate between two people, especially in a semi-formal setting such as tutoring. Perhaps you were even told by your parents or teachers that it's impolite to not look someone in the eye while speaking, especially when greeting someone or saying goodbye. However, this is not a universal characteristic of communication. In fact, this is perhaps why your student is avoiding your gaze. In many East Asian cultures, using a lot of eye contact while speaking communicates rudeness or even hostility. If you knew this about South Korean culture, or simply understood many nonverbal forms of communication are specific to certain cultures, there is a good chance you wouldn't have wondered if there was a problem. Instead, you might have guessed eye contact has a different meaning in South Korea than it does in the United States. Certain hand gestures also differ across cultural lines. In the U.S., when someone holds up a hand with their palm facing out, it is usually interpreted as meaning stop. Did you know, in certain Central Asian countries, it has a radically different meaning? If you were in Uzbekistan or Mongolia and someone held up their hand with their palm facing out, it would mean it was your turn to speak, or in other words, to go. Again, almost opposite meanings. Does this mean you have to memorize all the nonverbal communication gestures around the world in order to engage in successful intercultural communication? No, of course not. But what these examples do highlight is the importance of remembering people from different cultures sometimes ascribe different meanings to certain words, ideas, and gestures. Language is a vital part of any variation of human communication, including intercultural communication. It might be tempting to assume, however, that if you and your tutee speak the same language, the need for intercultural communication skills is diminished. While this can be the case, this is by no means a guarantee. The English language has dozens of dialects, many of them that use and interpret certain words and phrases differently from each other. Take a look at the list above. These are some commonly used words in both American and British English. Boot, Bobby, Doodle, Fizzy, Nark, tube. Do you know what they mean? If you were born and raised in the United States, or even spent significant time here, you probably knew what these words meant in America. But did you know what they meant in England? A boot is the trunk of a car, a bobby, a police officer. A doodle is an easy task, a fizzy, a soft drink. A nark is an irritant, and a tube is an underground train or subway. These are very different from how these words are used in most parts of America, wouldn't you agree? Again, this is a rather simple example of how knowledge of the same language does not necessarily mean we can communicate smoothly. However, if we remember that words and phrases can have different meanings to different groups of people, we are on our way to developing our intercultural communication skills. We are now going to move on to our third objective, developing cultural knowledge for the learners we serve. Remember the slide with the iceberg? This section is going to talk about a few of those observable cultural practices you might encounter as a tutor, the stuff that's above the waterline. One thing to keep in mind is that this section is going to be more about how to read and understand cultural differences and less about the specific beliefs, practices, and behaviors associated with certain cultures. As we previously stated, the goal is not to master knowledge about all cultures. That would be impossible. Instead, we want to develop awareness about how and why differences occur between cultures and what they mean in the context of communication. This objective is broken down into 6 key categories of culture. These are differences between systems of education, thoughts about what constitutes knowledge, how knowledge is organized, how silence is interpreted, how much physical space is appropriate, and what is the predominant social and political philosophy, individualistic or collectivistic. Keep in mind this by no means is an exhaustive list about cultural differences. It is, however, a good starting point in analyzing and understanding cultures. The United States system of education is nothing if not diverse. Characterized by multiple models, approaches, and goals, one could claim with little exaggeration that no two schools in the United States are alike. However, many K-12 systems are similar in that they offer a fair amount of flexibility for students, oftentimes allowing students to choose their own course of study as well as encouraging them to think both independently and creatively. And while the use of standardized tests is on the rise in many school districts, administrators and teachers still exercise a fair amount of discretion in choosing topics of study for their students. Finally, in recent years, K-12 districts in the U.S. have experienced a spike in integration of technology in their classrooms. Non-U.S. systems of education are also quite diverse, and while many of them mirror the philosophies and approaches which characterize U.S. schools, plenty of them don't. We needn't delve into the causes of these differences. For our purposes here, it will suffice to simply review some of the characteristics of schools elsewhere in the world. Many of them are hierarchical, which means both student and teacher roles are narrowly defined. Teachers are seen as experts and authorities and have the final word on a given subject matter. Teachers in schools which are organized like this also tend to command a lot of respect and prestige. Relatedly, schools with this organization will often use a rote method of instruction. Teachers will spend the majority of their time lecturing while students memorize and then eventually repeat the ideas presented, usually in the form of a final, all-encompassing exam. Finally, certain non-U.S. school systems can be described as being centralized, meaning the national government plays a sizable role in determining curriculum. This results in students' educational experiences being very similar to one another. This is not the place to debate which system is superior. Each one has its advantages and flaws. The point here is to be mindful that some of your students will have had different educational experiences than your own. This can play out in a variety of ways in a tutoring session. Think about it. If you work with a student who studied different bodies of knowledge than yourself and studied them in different ways, there is potential for communication breakdown. What you might otherwise take for granted, in terms of what is known, experienced, and so forth, might be quite different from your student's actual understanding. Furthermore, students who come from certain non-U.S. systems might be unaccustomed to the approach or style we take when tutoring. Regardless of where you work on campus, you will likely be encouraged to take a student-centered approach, one where you encourage the student to do a significant amount of the work him or herself. In the U.S., this is a common practice, but if your student is unaccustomed to this type of learning, it is our responsibility not only to help them become comfortable with it, but also to explain why we take this approach in the first place. Another thing we might take for granted is how culture can impact one's interpretation of knowledge. This might seem strange to some of us. A fact is a fact, right? Water is wet, the sky is blue, and so on. While these examples might hold true, our use of the term knowledge here is a bit more complex. Knowledge in the broader sense refers to information, descriptions, attitudes, beliefs, and other forms of thought that come to us through education and experience. Using this broader definition, we can think of lots of examples where knowledge differs. Many religions hold competing views on the same central figures. Political parties clash over what's best for the citizenry of a given district or country. And scientists, those creators and disseminators of knowledge, will argue vociferously over methods and findings. Here is an example to help clarify things. Researchers at the University of Michigan asked groups of Americans and East Asians to select the definition that most closely fits with their understanding of what a company is. Two options were, A, a company is a system designed to perform functions, or B, a company is an organization designed to further social relations. Over 75% of Americans answered option A for their definition, while the same percentage of East Asians responded by circling option B. For those researchers who understood that Americans can be very task-oriented in their thinking, while East Asians can be very relationship-oriented, this difference came as little surprise. However, for those of us who are unaware, these findings might seem surprising, even strange. What's important to remember here is that culture had a sizable impact on how the participants in the study interpreted the same thing, the definition of a company. This is one simple example of how different cultures can give rise to different bodies of knowledge, and is something to be mindful of while tutoring. Given differences like this are possible, it is important to be respectful of others' knowledge. A surefire way to alienate our students is to disregard their positions or perspectives on things. Of course, there might be times when the conflict over knowledge arises that you find uncomfortable. First, understand this is very rare, and second, know you can politely excuse yourself from a tutoring session if this arises. Another, more frequent experience is encountering knowledge which is inconsistent with the professor's expectations. If you feel this is the case, gently direct the student back to the assignment's expectations and ask if this is appropriate for this particular assignment. If you are still unsure, you might encourage the student to speak with the professor him or herself. 2 final reminders. 1. Culture does not determine knowledge. It can have an influence on it, but it does not have the only or final say. There are other factors which can influence what people hold as knowledge that go beyond culture. And 2, knowledge is always changing, within particular cultures and across them. What is considered true or real or important today might very well fade into memory as time marches on. Another important aspect of culture is how knowledge is organized and presented. Many of us are accustomed to both presenting and receiving our ideas in a straightforward, direct manner, where the main idea comes first and is then followed by smaller supporting ideas. Think of an essay you've had to write for a class, or even a newspaper or magazine article you've recently read. Chances are the main idea was introduced at the very beginning, while the rest of the text consisted of related ideas and concepts that supported the main idea. You will notice that many people will converse in this manner as well. In fact, if you take a moment to reflect on the organization of this presentation, you will see how it's front-loaded with big ideas or objectives, while the rest of the presentation gets into the specific details to clarify, support, and explain the main concepts. As seemingly intuitive as this organizational model is, it is far from the only way people might present their ideas. In fact, the direct and linear approach is really only endemic to certain Western cultures. Some people prefer to speak or write in an indirect style, where they might first make allusions or hint at their important ideas, or even ask a lot of questions in lieu of making direct statements. Sometimes people will start with smaller, ancillary ideas with the intent of building and growing them until they arrive at their main point. Finally, some speakers and writers prefer to take what might be called a circular approach. Here, they will propose multiple ideas, many of which are actually different, before zeroing in on the most important one they hope to convey. The important thing to remember is to withhold your expectations about the way or the order in which people present ideas. In other words, don't assume everyone speaks or writes with the same patterns of organization you find comfortable. Instead, try to search out meaning, focusing on the ideas themselves and not the manner in which they are presented. It is also a good idea to check your comprehension by asking questions like, I understand this to be your most important idea. Am I on the right track? Or, I want to make sure I am following your train of thought as you intend it. Can we go over your ideas again? Another thing tutors might not be aware of is how the speed and tone of conversations can, at times, vary among cultures. In the United States, there is typically almost no time lag between when a person stops talking and the other person starts. In fact, if no response is forthcoming within a moment or two, the speaker might perceive the listener as being bored or even rude. You will notice many Americans use a lot of filler language while conversing, like, yeah, so, Linguists think this is because Americans are somewhat uncomfortable with silences and use these words to fill in the gaps. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, this is not a common practice for all cultures. In some Asian and Indian cultures, silence is used as a form of respect, to indicate the listener is carefully considering the words of other speakers. This is especially the case in more formal settings, such as school and work, or when there is a discernible age difference between speakers. Although it is an atypical example, linguists have recorded gaps as long as 10 seconds between speakers in certain parts of India. For our purposes, just know that some people might be comfortable with conversation being punctuated by longer periods of silence. This doesn't mean they are being rude, or that they don't understand. In fact, it could be they are according you a certain respect as their tutor. The way people use physical space can be influenced by culture, not only in how the space is structured and organized, but also in terms of how it is experienced. While certain cultures might deem close proximity and physical contact among people as appropriate, others may not. The relationships between those involved also factor into what is acceptable and what isn't. In fact, behavior in regard to physical space is one of the most directly observable cultural differences there are, and one of the most varied. For example, in Western cultures, it is perfectly acceptable for a man and a woman to be together in public, even engaging in intimate contact like hand-holding. In other cultures, this is not permitted, and in certain conservative ones, even banned. Let's look at another example of these spatial differences. In Latin America, you may find complete strangers engaging in close contact with each other, on a bus, in a restaurant or club, when they are meeting someone for the first time. North Americans, however, prefer a modicum of space between themselves and people they do not know. In the United States, some might even interpret it as rude when someone stands or sits too close. You might be familiar with the phrase, violating my personal space. This is an excellent example of how U.S. culture views and practices the use of space. It's feasible that you could experience different cultural uses of space while tutoring. Some people might sit a little too close or too far away for your comfort. If a person is sitting too close, simply create a little more space between the two of you with your chair. If the person is sitting too far away for the tutoring to take place effectively, politely ask them if it is okay to move a little closer, explaining that it will facilitate a more constructive tutoring session. It is a bit of a simplification, but cultures can be divided into two types, individual and collective. Cultures in the United States and Western Europe are often thought to fall into the former category, emphasizing personal goals and achievement, having a high degree of competition, and placing a high value on individual choice. Conversely, cultures such as those from China, Korea, and Japan are thought to be collective. People in these cultures will, at times, emphasize group goals and achievements, especially those of the family, workplace, and school. Like we said, this is a bit of a simplification. You will find people from both cultures exhibiting characteristics of those from the other. Moreover, the examples we gave, U.S. cultures and East Asian cultures, are often thought to fall on extreme ends of the individualistic and collectivistic continuum. Most of the world's cultures will fall somewhere in between these two poles, and the degree to which they are either collectivistic or individualistic can be context-specific. For example, Mexican culture can be individualistic when it comes to the workplace, and yet collectivistic when it comes to the family. Of course, you are not expected to know how each culture skews and why. What you should remember, though, is that this individualistic, collectivistic continuum exists, and people might be more group-oriented in certain situations and less so in others. Furthermore, it's good to keep in mind not everyone is as individualistic as many people in the United States are. There is a consensus in the research that the U.S. is one of the most individualized societies in the world. Some of your students might not count among those who are. They may seem less vocal or less direct about certain goals. They may seem less comfortable or experienced doing things on their own. When you encounter students like this, just remember to try to work within their comfort zones. And remember, knowledge is a social construct. You and your tutee work together to create meaning and ideas. So long as you abide by this, you shouldn't have too many challenges working with students who have collectivistic dispositions. A couple of closing remarks about developing cultural knowledge before we move on. Try to remember that the ideas presented for this objective are by no means exhaustive. Cultures have innumerable traits and characteristics. Here, we've reviewed only a handful. Try also to keep in mind that some of these descriptions are somewhat simplified. The concept of culture is extremely complex, and to talk about these things in a detailed manner would take much more time than we have in this training. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, avoid deterministic thinking. Just because some of the traits and behaviors might exist within certain cultures, it does not mean that all members of that culture will exhibit them. Like the idea of culture, human beings themselves are highly complex in their thinking and actions. As a tutor, you must remain open to the differences that exist between any two people. Resist stereotyping. Now that we've discussed and defined a few key concepts, let's look at some strategies we can use to implement what we have learned in our tutorial sessions. First, when you find yourself in an intercultural exchange, especially if the student speaks a language other than English, try to remember to speak clearly by enunciating your words and using short, concise sentences. The language you use is also important, so avoiding slang and a lot of technical language is helpful. It is also a good idea to speak at an even pace and normal volume. Raising your voice does not increase comprehension. You might also consider providing instruction in an easy-to-follow sequence and to check for comprehension as you go. You can do this by simply asking your student if they are able to follow along or if they need anything clarified. Finally, many students find it useful when tutors write things down. This gives them things to refer to without overly taxing their memories. An assumption is something that is accepted as true or factual without having any evidence. In the context of intercultural communication, assumptions often take the form of generalizations about someone based on previous experiences, what others tell us, the media, and so on. Remember, culture does not determine one's behavior, and people will often think and act differently than what you might expect. For example, you may have had the opportunity to work with several Spanish-speaking students and notice that they tend to use adjectives in ways that are different from how native English speakers use them. Although this might be something you have experienced several times, it does not mean every Spanish speaker you encounter will do this. For tutors, perhaps the biggest problem about making assumptions is that we will look for things that are not there, and while we are consumed for searching for these behaviors, we risk missing out on the individual student's strengths and needs. Practicing both tolerance and empathy are very important to intercultural communication. Tolerance is the willingness to acknowledge ideas or behaviors we don't entirely understand or entirely agree with. While there are, of course, limits to tolerance, it is important to remember that there is often no single way to think about or do something. Usually there are many. Evaluating people's preferences in the tutoring setting can limit your success. Instead, try to be mindful of how there are usually many different approaches to or perspectives on the same issue or concept. Empathy is the ability to see things from another person's perspective. It is related to tolerance in that it requires you to create some distance between yourself and your own preferences. We must try to understand the preferences of others. If we can see things from someone else's perspective, it will help us gain an appreciation for why they might prefer to approach things differently than we do ourselves. Many students experience anxiety when working with a tutor, especially for the first time. Some students are not sure what to expect or are worried that they might experience some form of judgment. When anxiety sets in, it can hamper student learning and frustrate tutors. However, if we exhibit kindness and patience with students and make them feel safe, valued, and welcomed, anxiety levels will hopefully diminish. Culture shock is similar to anxiety in that it can be a roadblock to learning. Culture shock manifests itself as a feeling of disorientation in new, unfamiliar environments. It is a very real and common experience for people who are new to a different culture or country. If you have a student who is experiencing mild levels of culture shock, you should try to help alleviate it by discussing tutoring practices and goals. However, for students who experience higher levels of culture shock, you should gently refer him or her to their advisor or put them in contact with your supervisor. Intercultural communication can be a challenging experience, even for those individuals with a lot of knowledge and experience in the subject. If and when you experience a situation which proves to be unbridgeable, remember you have other tutors or your supervisor at your disposal for assistance. Sometimes, all that is required is a fresh perspective or a new set of ears to help you and your student to overcome the specific challenge. Addressing the situation in a transparent and polite manner is the best way to deal with communication breakdown. However, you should do so in a way that does not place blame or responsibility on the student for the impasse. Instead, try to talk about the challenge in a neutral way. Then follow up by asking if it's okay to invite another tutor into the conversation. You can say something like, "We seem to be experiencing some challenges communicating right now. Do you mind if we talk with another tutor for a moment to see if the three of us can work through this together?" If you discuss the challenge out in the open and do so in a polite and constructive way, you will likely find that the student is open to your suggestion. At first glance, this might seem a little awkward or uncomfortable. However, it is to the student's advantage to acknowledge the situation rather than to ignore it or hope that it will somehow go away. Remember, communication is of the utmost importance while tutoring, and it is incumbent upon us as tutors to do everything we can to make sure the lines of communication remain healthy and open. Although it's more of a long-term goal than strategy, learning about cultures, both your own and others, can be very helpful to you as a tutor. By taking stock in your own culture, you will come to understand what it means, why it is important to you, and how it is learned. As we've discussed in this presentation, it is sometimes tempting to take our own culture for granted and to assume that it is somehow standard or normal or correct. However, once we start to understand it for what it is, as something complex, historical, and learned, we will start to see that it is just but one culture among many in the world. This, in turn, will help us to become more open and accepting of others' preferences and ways of doing things. Lastly, it is a good idea to learn about other cultures too. It is a cliché, But knowledge really is power. And the more we learn about the ideas, preferences, and worldviews of others, the better position we are in to engage in successful intercultural communication. You can do this by taking advantage of opportunities to work with students with different cultural backgrounds, or by tapping into the many resources GRCC offers. Regardless of how you go about this, becoming a student of culture will enrich both your own and your students' experiences. We hope this training has been useful and somewhat interesting for you. If, in the future, you have questions or would like some advice, be sure to ask your supervisor. Please turn in your responses to the corresponding assessment. Thank you for your time and attention.